Let's talk about House of the Dragon, because we gotta get that hot D, baby. The Game of Thrones spin-off returned for its second season a few weeks ago. Its first season was a massive hit for the cable network, and the second season looks to be living up to that. The premiere attracted 7.8 million viewers, and it gave the streaming service Max its biggest day ever. The same week, it was announced that HBO had not only commissioned a third season of the show, but it entered production on Night of the Seven Kingdoms, a second Game of Thrones spin-off. It seems safe to say that HBO is the real House of the Dragon. However, it also cements a real shift that has taken place over the past couple of years in both what kind of shows HBO is producing and the television landscape as a whole. So this week, we're going to talk about the end of the prestige television era and how the standard bearer for that era has entered its IP age. We're not going to be talking too much about spoilers for the shows themselves, so you can watch along without any worry. With that in mind, let's get on with it. I see no reason for this introduction to drag on. As a cable television network, HBO spent decades establishing itself as a quality brand. In some ways, relying on subscriptions rather than advertising revenue could be seen to prefigure the modern streaming services. As a result, HBO had to sell itself as a provider that offered something that viewers couldn't get on broadcast networks like ABC, NBC, and CBS. As the company boasted in its publicity, it's not TV, it's HBO.
It's HBO? Oh. Where is this coming from?
I'm wondering that too.
Initially, the channel offered exclusive sporting events and movies. They put the box office in home box office. However, it eventually pivoted into television programming with shows like Dream On, Arliss, Oz, and Sex and the City, a show that New Yorker television critic Emily Nussbaum argues prefigured the generation of difficult men that would come to define prestige television. At the turn of the millennium, HBO would strike gold with creator-led projects like David Chase's The Sopranos, David Milch's Deadwood, and David Simon's The Wire. Through shows like these, HBO laid the foundations of what would come to be known as the golden age of television, leading other broadcasters to produce shows like Breaking Bad or Mad Men. These shows were revolutionary. For decades, television had been treated as a vast wasteland, inherently less prestigious than cinema because of the formal, budgetary, and content constraints. The length of a television episode was determined by its slot in the broadcast schedule. Its content was largely limited by the need to sell space to advertisers, so you couldn't be too controversial or provocative. Its narrative complexity was restricted by the need to produce material that could be sold into syndication and aired out of sequence on any number of subsidiary networks. HBO changed all of that by embracing a creative revolution akin to the New Hollywood movement that had redefined mainstream American cinema in the 1970s. These shows could tell complicated stories about morally ambiguous characters, challenging the audience. As mainstream cinema became more homogenous, stars fled to television. HBO was a game changer and everybody took notice. In 2013, Netflix president Ted Sarandos boasted, "The goal is to become HBO before HBO can become us." That quote's maybe going to seem a little ironic in a couple of minutes. However, by around 2013, the golden age of television was fading. That year, Breaking Bad wrapped up and Mad Men launched the first half of its bifurcated final season. In July, Brett Martin published his seminal history of the era, Difficult Men, which aimed to mythologize the creators of the period like Peter Biskind's Easy Riders Raging Bulls had done for the great director of the 1970s. However, by that point, HBO was in a bit of a creative slump. The television channel produced zeitgeisty hits like Girls, Euphoria, and Succession. It also produced critical darlings like The Leftovers. However, there were also shows that clearly failed to connect in the way that the network had intended them to. Shows like Aaron Sorkin's The Newsroom, Jonah Nolan and Lisa Joy's Westworld, Martin Scorsese and Terrence Winter's Boardwalk Empire, David Simon's The Deuce, Mike White and Laura Dern's Enlightenment, among many others. Hell, did you know that HBO produced several seasons of a prestige television show about American football starring Denzel Washington's son and The Rock? Yeah, I haven't watched an episode of it either.
Where'd you come from?
There were also a number of very expensive and very high-profile flops from brand-name creators like David Milch and Michael Mann's Luck or Martin Scorsese and Terrence Winter's Vinyl. However, these challenges and missteps were disguised by what FX CEO John Landgraf described as the rising tide of peak TV. Year on year during the 2010s, more television was produced than ever before. 409 scripted original shows in 2015, 455 in 2016, 487 in 2017, 495 in 2018, 532 in 2019. There was a minor dip to 493 in 2020, gee, I wonder what might have possibly caused that, but the number climbed again to 559 in 2021, and then to 599 in 2022. Audiences were, to put it frankly, inundated with content. While nobody knew exactly what was going to follow prestige television, it had to be out there somewhere in that sea of content, right? However, the existence of a peak implies the reality of a decline. And so it happened. In 2023, the number of television shows produced declined by 14% from 2022. If the prestige era had been followed by the peak era, it was time for whatever was gonna come next. Of course, this is only part of the story. In the past couple of years, HBO has bounced between corporate owners with all the energy of Brad Pitt crossing the street in Meet Joe Black. Current Warner Discovery CEO and yacht enthusiast David Zaslav has committed himself to ruthlessly exploiting the company's intellectual property assets that led the company's previous business daddy to put the Droogs from A Clockwork Orange in the last Looney Tunes movie that they could be bothered to release. And to be fair, it's kind of a hard pivot after you Me Too'd Pepe Le Pew.
Hello, Pepe.
In September 2022, the current president of Warner Bros. Discovery International, Gerhard Zieler, announced that the company would, quote, focus more on the development of franchises. Long regarded for its prestige, HBO became another intellectual property farm. The Sopranos produced a theatrical sequel, The Many Saints of Newark, aka Once Upon a Time in Jersey. And just like that, Sex and the City begat a streaming sequel series. Hell, HBO rebooted Perry Mason as a gritty, grimy drama.
George, the tanks have been wiped out by a wall of flames. Neither man nor his machines are able to stop this creature.
In recent years, HBO has leaned into adaptations of geek-friendly intellectual property, including a 3-season adaptation of Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials, and an adaptation of the video game The Last of Us, which has been a smash hit. Damon Lindelof followed up The Leftovers with a sequel series to Watchmen, a beloved comic book published by Warner subsidiary DC. That's to say nothing of Max, HBO's sister streaming service, which until recently was known as HBO Max, where original shows like Tokyo Vice and Warrior have been cancelled to make room for series tied to other studio properties like Peacemaker, The Penguin, and The Sisterhood. If there is a single property that embodies the values of this new era of HBO, it is Game of Thrones. In 2011, the network launched a sprawling and expensive adaptation of the Song of Ice and Fire novels by George R.R. Martin. The series became a cultural phenomenon.
I'm a widow girl who acts like a widow boy, and I'm a killer with my widow sword.
Next.
No, wait, one more.
It won more Emmys than any other primetime show in a single year. It was a huge rating success. The finale was the most watched episode in the history of HBO. It was also the most pirated show in the world. At a time when HBO was floundering, Game of Thrones offered a viable path forward. Hell, when the show ended, there was an existential crisis among television critics about the idea that it might be the last show that we all watched together. It was a big deal. And, for all that online fans might aggressively argue that the divisive ending to Game of Thrones killed any interest in the franchise, audiences seem eager to return to Westeros. The studio has announced enough potential Game of Thrones spin-offs to fill a Kevin Feige PowerPoint. Setting aside the cancelled Fleet Bottom and Blood Moon spin-offs, and the Jon Snow spin-off, which we know nothing of at the moment, there's plans for a show about Robert's Rebellion, the Golden Empire, 10,000 Ships, the Sea Snake, Aegon's Conquest, the now in production Night of the Seven Kingdoms, and obviously the now airing House of the Dragon. Now, not all of those proposed shows are going to make it to air. However, if even half of them enter production, that's an incredible commitment of resources and attention from the cable broadcaster. This is just a very clear vision of what HBO is now. It's a factory that produces more of the things that audiences already know that they like. And to be clear, many of these shows are great. I actually really enjoy House of the Dragon. I loved Peacemaker. I thought The Last of Us was fantastic. And HBO is still producing some content outside of established brands such as Mike White's anthology show White Lotus. However, the streaming service's most high-profile original show in recent years was The Idol, a show starring The Weeknd that had such a weak ending that viewers just assumed, inaccurately, that HBO decided not to air the 6th episode. HBO recently aired The Sympathizer, which is a prestige miniseries adaptation of a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel from one of the most beloved directors in the world, starring no fewer than 4 different versions of Oscar-winning actor Robert Downey Jr. However, even profiles covering the production of the show acknowledge that it feels like an oddity in the current climate, as the show's green light predated the Discovery merger. This feels like more the end of something than the start of it. Even original pitches are now beholden to established brands. When Mexican filmmaker Issa Lopez approached HBO with her pitch for a murder mystery set in the Arctic, the broadcaster suggested that she folded into the established True Detective brand. To be fair, Lopez did this enthusiastically. She seemed to genuinely enjoy the idea of making a True Detective show. However, True Detective Night Country really suffers from the heavy-handed continuity references and in-jokes intruding into what would otherwise be a perfectly serviceable murder mystery. Then again, people tuned in to watch it. This approach clearly works. To be clear, this isn't just a problem with HBO. This is happening across the industry. Streaming services are clogged with revivals of older shows. Frasier, Night Court, Leverage, X-Men the Animated Series, and even Barney. IP sprawls across streaming services, like Brad Pitt across the windscreen of a car in Meet Joe Black. Still, all of this gets at what follows the era of prestige television and peak TV. The IP age. That's perhaps another way that HBO is like the House of the Dragon. They're keeping it all in the family.
Family, 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 family.
I've been Darren Mooney, and this was The Backdrop.
If you've been enjoying our work for the past 6 months and want to help make sure we're sustainable for the long haul, joining us over on Patreon is the best way to make that happen. You can get a ton of great perks like ad-free podcasts, some written columns from Darren and Mooney and occasionally other writers, merch discounts, monthly movie nights, voting for the Game Yahtzee reviews during the summer game drought, and more. Your support so far has allowed us to continue bringing you the content you enjoy unimpeded, and we look forward to doing so for many more years to come. We release our financials publicly to you once a quarter so you can see how the business is doing and where your money is going. You can view our latest report for Q2 over on Patreon, the YouTube community tab, Twitter, or our Discord. Along with all the series, streams, and podcasts you've come to love, we have a lot of exciting things on the horizon. Be on the lookout for our new entertainment podcast, The Rewind, Marty's new retro show, The Archive, our upcoming Animal Well documentary, and the next big video from Good Blood, Metal Gear Untold. All coming soon to Second Wind.